The language of the occult and magic and all of these things that are popular today, she kind of was talking about long before, just a renewed interest in female surrealist artists. And I think also that her life story is just really incredible.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. The artist Gertrude Abercrombie is not someone whose name I knew until very recently, but she's definitely a name to know now. Born in 1909 in Austin, Texas, and dying in 1977 in Chicago, Abercrombie was a painter of witchy surrealist canvases. They seem like lucid dreams, full of haunted landscapes, lone women, masked figures, barren trees, forked paths, and mysterious towers. In life, Abercrombie was a remarkable character herself. She was variously known as the Queen of Chicago for her big presence in Hyde Park, where she presided over a vibrant, self-curated social scene at a stately Victorian-era home, and as the Jazz Witch for her enthusiastic support of Chicago jazz in the 40s and 50s and her personal affectation of wearing a peaked witch's hat. Abercrombie was long a pretty obscure figure, but in recent years, her art has seen a remarkable upsurge of interest, culminating in an exciting touring exhibition of her paintings that is right now at the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, called Gertrude Abercrombie, The Whole World is a Mystery. ArtNet has run multiple stories on Abercrombie recently, one by Katie White, recounting her life and art, and one by Eileen Kinsella, tracking this once nearly forgotten artist's recent return to the spotlight nearly a half-century after her death. We're going to talk to both of them to get both parts of the story. We'll start with Katie White. Katie White, thanks for coming on the show to talk about Gertrude Abercrombie.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, I'm really excited because this story has everything. I feel like it's a real Katie White special. And we're going to talk about this art, which is witchy and weird. But before we do, I want to talk about Gertrude Abercrombie as a character, because she was a character, and that's part of the fascination of her as an artist and also a key to understanding the art. So who was Gertrude Abercrombie?
Yeah, so Gertrude Abercrombie is this Chicago-based artist. She was born in 1909 in Austin, Texas, and her childhood is like something out of a book. Her parents were itinerant opera singers, and she kind of slingshotted around the world as a child. She lived in Texas, she lived in Berlin, but her dad's family was from Illinois, and they wound up coming back to the Chicago area, and they settled in Hyde Park, which is this kind of Bohemian enclave that's outside of the University of Chicago area. So she emerged as a painter really in the 1930s, and she kind of developed this visual language even early in the 30s that would define her career kind of until her death. She died in 1977, and it's these like desolate landscapes, lonely women type of look.
She worked for the Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression. Is that right?
That is true. And I love Works Progress Administration artists. So that's actually what really allowed her to devote herself to painting. So she started painting in the 30s. She was part of the Federal Art Project, which employed many, many artists that we know today during the Great Depression. So she was part of that program from 1935 to 1940. And she was kind of tasked, as with like all of the artists, as part of that program of making one artwork a month. So she produced one oil painting a month. She had like a quote that I actually wrote down because it was so good. This 1977 interview, that was a very famous radio interview she did. She died that same year. It's kind of her looking back on her life. And she says, each month we all got, if we were first-class citizens, we got $94 a month, which was marvelous in 1935. That gave me a big start and a boost. God bless Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We all worked so hard. We really worked from morning till whenever we got up. It saved some of our lives, and it started me on my career. So, great lady.
Yes, and her paintings do have, I guess you'd call them magical realism or something, which was, surrealism was coming into focus in the 1930s, but also comes out of the social realism of the 1930s period of art. What's the next step in her journey?
So I think she's just like a really interesting character for the time. A lot of people kind of called her the jazz witch, and sort of like understanding Gertrude Abercrombie is deeply tied into understanding the music scene in Chicago during these years, which is more so than other artists. She knew some other visual artists, but she was really in the mix with a bunch of writers and musicians, and Dizzy Gillespie, who's like one of the most famous jazz musicians, famous trumpeters, was one of her best friends and her confidant. There are tons of pictures of them together.
There's a wonderful picture in your story of them hugging, which I guess is a very famous piece and shows how intimate they were.
Yeah, one of their birthdays. If you want to imagine her in Chicago, she owned this 4-story Victorian home in Hyde Park. And there she would host all sorts of musicians during her life there with her first husband, Robert Livingston, and then her second husband, this man by the name of Frank Sanford. So it was like Charlie Parker, Sarah Vaughan, Sonny Rollins, really, really famous jazz musicians that would stay at her home too. So she kind of created in this unlikely milieu of not so many visual artists, but a real musical scene.
And an interracial scene in the 1940s, 1950s, when that would have been pretty remarkable, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's like one of the things that curators have pointed out is that so these jazz musicians were coming into Chicago to perform, but a lot of hotels were not accepting Black people at that time. So her home became kind of this refuge where people would stay, sometimes just for a few nights, sometimes longer. So yeah, it was a really kind of constant party place to be.
And her second husband, correct me if I'm wrong, he was a music critic and jewel thief, and that's kind of one of the connections to the music scene?
Yeah.
The music criticism, not the jewel theft.
Well, yeah. She had a kind of wild personal life, which is also part of the fun. So she had a daughter, Dinah, with her first marriage, and then her first husband, I think they were like both having affairs and things just kind of fell apart. And so she soon after married this guy, Frank Sanford, and I think she was sort of already in the kind of jazz world scene, but he was really in it. Yeah, and he was a jewel thief, and, you know, she was really a spendthrift, so that was part of one of her issues in life. And there's some detail in an essay I read. She had like a fleet of fancy cars in this neighborhood, and everyone thought her second husband was like her chauffeur because he was just out like cleaning her cars at all times. I don't know.
And so this story, she grew up, parents were opera singers. She has this sort of unconventional life. Her mom was quite hard on her too, correct?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. So what's really interesting is that she's very enmeshed in this scene of writers. Thornton Wilder was a really good friend of hers. And then these jazz musicians, and she was really beloved, and they devoted essays, music to her and things like that. But she also had like a lot of personal turmoil. And like part of that was that her mother was very, very critical of her looks. I mean, she was like a tall woman, and her mother told her she was very plain. And so I think kind of to compensate for that, or maybe to push back on that, she dressed really elaborately. So part of the jazz witch is that she would literally wear like a witch's pointed hat, and she would wear like a leopard coat all of the time, and capes, and dress really, really flamboyantly. But that was always like some sort of world of inner criticism that she dealt with. Her mother had been very, very hard on her.
Yeah, somehow I think that's important. Just that, Robert Storr in the essay you were talking about, describing the Hyde Park world that she was a part of, says that she resembled Morticia Addams, sometimes from the Addams family. And it just does seem like a lot of aspects of her life, the style of the art, the way she personally dressed, and the entire social world she built of Bohemian folks around her all point to kind of different ways of just identifying with the mainstream way people behaved. So we should get into her art. What are the influences on it? She called it bop art, I know, which points to some kind of musical influence.
Yeah, she called it bop art, which is a term I've never seen anywhere else. I mean, bop is like a style of jazz that emerged in the 1940s, so that would make sense. You know, that was kind of the scene she was in. There was a musician, I can't remember the name, who devoted a piece of music to her called Gertrude's Bop. So it was like about her kind of way of walking. But I don't know if bop art is anything beyond her. But the visual artist she was influenced by, she didn't really talk too much about it, actually. She was a friend of Dorothea Tanning's, which I think is interesting. They knew each other.
Very famous surrealist.
Yeah, and much later in her life, she said that she thought of Magritte as her quote-unquote spiritual daddy. And I do think that that's a good parallel for her work, because in his world of kind of solitary men with bowler hats, you can see a comparison to her single women in their witch hats and the kind of like
Right.
uncanny landscapes. And I think in both their work, a very mundane object can take on a lot of symbolic power. So Magritte, maybe it's an apple, and in her world, it's an owl or a cat or something like that.
Yes, her paintings to me, I would have said they look like a cross between René Magritte and Remedios Varo. They have a sort of a storybook look. But yeah, now that you say it, Dorothy Tanning makes a lot of sense. You know, these sort of spaces of loneliness, psychic drama, kind of muted color palette punctuated by some mysterious color choices. And that just sort of general sense of psychic dislocation with a little bit of playfulness in there that you get from those artists.
Yeah, for sure. She's often really described as a surrealist, and I understand why she is. But I also think that there's something very like American noir about her work that also makes it a little bit different. And I think something that sometimes get lost in the mix is that she really is a self-taught artist. She took some kind of small classes at the Art Institute of Chicago, but her degree was in Romance languages. So she really taught herself how to paint. And I think it does kind of have a little bit of that as well.
Yeah, you call it in your article simple, strange, her style.
Yeah.
And I think that also is a very strong current in Chicago art. And she was discovered later as an inspiration for some of these Chicago artists like Harry who did these weird figurative paintings, but were also very interested in self-taught art as something very generative. She also met Gertrude Stein, right, in 1935, and that was an influence on her.
Yeah, so the one thing she did talk about kind of extensively as an art world influence on her was this encounter with Gertrude Stein, who she met when she was in Chicago in 1935. And Gertrude Stein is this salonier, American-born, who was so pivotal.
There's a connection that both Gertrudes had salons.
Yeah, Gertrude to Gertrude, Chicago to Paris. So she met her through Thornton Wilder, the playwright, who was friends with both of them. Stein essentially told her, you have to learn how to draw better, which I think is funny. She told her she had to improve her drawing skills, and she really set about doing that. But then when I was talking to the curator of, there's this big show at the Carnegie Museum of Art right now, and one of the co-curators, this woman, Sarah Humphreyville, when she was talking to me about her, she said, it went beyond just learning technical skills. A lot of Gertrude Stein's writing is about these layers of reality and a lot about repetition and things like that. And that when you read Gertrude Stein's writing about art, you can see a lot of what Gertrude Abercrombie is thinking about.
You quote her in an article, the rhetorical effectiveness of repetition, questioning the distinction between inside and outside, and layers of realness soon visually manifested themselves in Abercrombie's art and would remain features of it for the rest of her career. And I think once you have that in your mind, you do see it. We wanted to talk about a specific artwork, and I think the artwork that you wanted to talk about, actually, that idea of layers of reality, of art layering on itself, really features in this work.
Yeah, so the painting that was the lead image for my article, and which is like a major painting in the museum exhibition that's up right now, is this 1948 painting called Where or When Things Pass, and it's from 1948.
Amazing painting.
Yeah, it's in the collection of the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art, and so much of her work is in the collections of these Midwestern smaller institutions, which I think is really cool. And so this painting shows a woman in a coral dress at the center. It's a simple dress, and she's standing in like an almost empty room, and she's holding this piece of string between her two arms, and then the string kind of follows outwards to both sides. One side is attached to a cat on the floor, and the other side to a witch's hat that's like seated on the ground in the room. And it's a room with a black floor and these kind of dark gray walls. And
almost looks purgatorial or some kind of limbo space.
Yeah, and there's not really much in the room, right? It doesn't look like a room that you would define as any sort of living space. And there's tacked on one wall is kind of just like a simple piece of paper. There's a table with nothing on it, but there is on the wall behind her this painting. And when I was looking at the painting I'm talking about, the painting that's on the wall in this painting looks like it could be another one of her works. And when I was researching it, I realized that it looks almost exactly like this painting called Untitled Woman, Tethered Horse and Moon from 1947. So this painting shows a horse and a tree on this kind of gnarled tree in a weird, mysterious background. And they're exactly the same, except for in the painting on the wall, there's no woman. But the woman seems to be the woman in the center of the room itself, the woman in the coral dress. So it's this very kind of mind game playing as though the woman from the painting has stepped out of the painting and into the room. And I feel like a lot of her paintings have this feeling of spaces moving into other spaces, like where are you really oriented? And I just find it super fascinating.
Yeah, it's like someone moving between mental worlds or moving between artworks of the mind. Is the female figure in her paintings, is that herself?
Yeah, she basically always said that she presented herself, and she referred to the act of painting her own face as almost like putting on makeup. It's like what she knew and what she was used to. They're not kind of self-portraits in the traditional sense. It's more that that's the face that she knew. And a lot of these works are about kind of psychic landscapes. And it would make sense that she would be the person in these kind of dream worlds. She's the one creating them.
Yeah, they're like a magic version of herself.
Yeah, exactly.
An enchanted version of herself. That's a question I have, Katie. These paintings do look quite occult. They have these magical symbols, witchy symbols. Are they occult, or is that more of a theme in them?
I think it's more of a theme than anything. I think it's something she kind of like intentionally cultivated, but a line that she used about her own work is that she made simple things strange. So I think that is part of just seeing the strangeness in everyday life. And we had talked about this a bit in the article. Okay, she dressed herself in a witch's hat. And a lot of these objects were objects from her real life. Even though they appear very strange, there's these weird conch shells that kind of take on this surrealist augury. But those were objects that she had in her own house. A lot of the landscapes are actually based on landscapes from Aledo, Illinois, which is where her grandparents lived. And one of the other motifs that she used a lot are these repeated doors kind of lined up next to each other that seem very surrealist, but I learned were a part of urban renewal when they were gutting urban environments and old buildings, that the construction sites would have these multiple doors on them. So it was something she would have seen in her own neighborhood since Hyde Park was undergoing urban renewal during like the 40s, 50s, 60s.
Yeah, it's interesting because that particular image is this painting of three doors side by side, sort of freestanding, or they appear to be like magical portals or something in one of these surrealist empty rooms. And then in a way, it is also just a real scene from the construction that was around her as this neighborhood, this little micro utopia she'd created for herself of creative life was changing. There's a quote from your article from her that I really like. She says, "Surrealism is meant for me because I am a pretty realistic person, but I don't like all I see." And I did love that from your piece, this idea that a lot of this stuff were real objects from her world that she was painting, but at the same time, it seems like she was trying to build a magical world around herself, or a world that was enchanted with creativity. And it's just like the painting that you highlighted, is passing from reality into art and art into reality. Pretty delightful, really. Where did she end up?
So her life took a bit of a sad turn, I guess. She had issues with alcoholism and she had issues with arthritis. So by the 1950s, her health had really started to decline and she didn't really make any lifestyle changes. So by the later years of her life, she was using a wheelchair. She still remained very beloved in Chicago. In 1977, there was a retrospective of her.
The year she died, yeah.
Yeah, the year she died. This curator, Dawn Baum of the Hyde Park Art Center, organized a retrospective of her works there, and a lot of her living friends and musicians came and celebrated her. So she was still very well known in Chicago. She never really had, it seemed like, big ambitions. She did show in New York, but she never really had big ambitions to kind of be nationally known or internationally known. there's this quote that was about that 1977 exhibition that I liked from a critic named Dennis Adrian. And it says, "There is a special quality of personal artistic statement, her involvement with contemporary American art other than her own field, and her confident commitment to our city's rambunctiously active culture." So she really was a Chicago artist and happy being that.
That's delightful.
When she died, the thing that I thought was also super interesting is that in her will, she only left like 1 or 2 paintings to her daughter and a couple of close friends, but she wanted all of her works to go into institutions, and she wanted them to be institutions throughout Illinois. So a lot of her paintings are in like Illinois State Museum in Springfield, which is a college and museum, but they have a huge collection of her work.
It really does seem like she was very committed to art, but mainly committed to her art as the act of just being herself, being exactly the quirky person that she was. And in a certain sense, I think that's why it continues to resonate now, because it has its own really strong sense of self in it.
Yeah.
On that note, let's turn it over to Eileen to talk about the second half of this story, why she's back in the news. And now I want to turn to Eileen Kinsella, who has a second article about Gertrude Abercrombie, the second part of this story, which is her contemporary rediscovery. Hello, Eileen.
Hi, Ben.
So I will be honest, I didn't know this artist. When was the first time you heard the name Gertrude Abercrombie?
Yeah, actually, that's a very interesting question. Just a few weeks ago, because Andrew Russeth and I were talking about who might be a good candidate for these columns that I do from time to time, called The Appraisal, where we take a look at somebody who oftentimes has been under-recognized. I mean, I sort of knew about her name, but it was the first time that I ever really took a look at the work and really took a look at all that was going on, including this traveling museum show. Yeah, so that was my first introduction to her.
Yeah, so you, like me, are new to this artist, and she has had just a remarkable resurgence in the last few years. I mean, 50 years after her passing, what was her reputation like before? Was it like she was a mystery, as she was to us?
Yeah, it was really a fascinating story for me to report out, because I did speak with Zach Worsom in Heinemann Auctions in Chicago, now Freeman's Heinemann, and he told me that he had been seeing her work around since 2007, 2008, and he's the son of a very famous artist, Carl Worsom from the Harry Who.
Right.
He said he grew up in the Chicago art world. He felt he was very knowledgeable about a lot of artists, and immediately called his mother and was like, "How come you never talked about this artist? How come you never told me about her?" And his mother just said she wasn't really on the radar. She was before your time. But he started seeing a lot of her work at auction, and there was this sort of cult, really devotion following to her in Chicago, which is, where she lived and worked. She was pretty active at the time. She was almost like a well-kept secret in Chicago.
Do you know if she was well collected? I mean, it seems like she gave away a lot of her art to intimates and so on.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. What he told me was that she showed at Marshall Field's, which, shockingly, had a really good art gallery in the 1960s. It was one of their departments of their department store, which I loved. I love that fact. And she also would show at this very popular, at the time, art fair called the 57th Street Art Fair, which was in nearby Hyde Park. And as I understand it, she either sold directly to interested collectors or gifted things to people. And so kind of by default, it was she almost controlled her own exposure. She sort of chose who she wanted to sell or gift to. So it was sort of if you were lucky enough to know her, maybe you could buy or get one of her paintings. So again, a small specialized group.
I was looking at this one-page statement by and about her, a press release that's in the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art. And it was saying, her work has been collected by such people as Thornton Wilder, the famous writer, as well as it's in the collections of Dizzy Gillespie, Sarah Vaughan, Max Roche, Hildegard, who's a singer.
Yeah.
And she's in the collection of the famous jazz musicians who were around her, but kind of not almost in the art scene in a way.
Yeah, I mean, she just sort of was kind of quietly going about her work, seemed to be always steadily working, really embracing her paintings. And it's after a number of years, after being sold at these smaller regional auction houses, it was almost sort of the broader art world woke up to how cool these paintings are and how great the images of isolation and loneliness are, and strikes a chord with broader surrealism.
So I think it's interesting for people to know this second chapter of the story, that she had a whole life and maybe it seemed like the story was over, and then very suddenly, recently, within the last few years, has had this huge new chapter. What is the moment when the page turned?
A lot of people mark 2018 with the show at Karma Gallery that Dan Nadel organized. One thing I wanted to mention, because I think it's really key, is like everybody that I spoke to about her had this moment where they said when they discovered her work, it was just like this moment of revelation, like, wow, like I fell in love with it and I saw it. And like at least 3 people I spoke to said similar things. And it's like, then that notion got
It's like
brought.
they were enchanted by it. Yeah.
Yeah. And that notion got picked up by a broader audience. And also I understand that Brendan Dugan had a similar reaction to her. So they mounted this key show at Karma Gallery. And right around the same time, there was a show at Elmhurst Museum in Chicago by Jenny Gibbs. And those two things, as far as I can tell, market-wise especially, were like the tipping point. That was like this broad revelation that really like woke the broader art world up to what a great artist she was. It fits in with surrealism. And from then it just kind of tipped over into the broader market. Prices were modest, but they started ticking up a lot. You were able to get something between $1,000 and $15,000 back in 2007. And now the highest price is like $860,000. It's just under $1 million, which might still be modest as far as contemporary stars go, but it shows you the steep increase in her market.
We know anything about who is discovering them or finding them now?
No, I mean, as I understand it, they're kind of hard to come by. So some of them do come out of the region. And when they do, they're kind of treated carefully. They're usually still estimated fairly conservatively and then take off. But I imagine that at this point, still, there's a lot of them in like local regional collections in the Midwest.
I mean, I do love the story of this 2018 gallery show, which was very well reviewed. Roberta Smith in the New York Times gave it a glowing review, was a critic's pick. And I do love the idea of the work of these folks discovering something and kind of entering a new character into art history. I think that's kind of inspiring and interesting. How unusual is it in the art market or in art history for there to be this kind of rewriting, a new character emerging?
I feel like it's been a little bit more frequent lately with the both broader interest in female artists like abstract expressionists and surrealists who may have been overlooked. One thing that I do find interesting is how it happens, how the resurgence happens, because in her case, I feel like it was almost kind of more organic. There was these pockets of interest in her work. And then it's like Karma took an interest and promoted this show. And then there was the museum show. And then like the market started growing. It feels a little bit more organic than sometimes some other artists. And I'm not saying this in a judgy way or anything, but sometimes other artists who start to get more attention and get rediscovered, you sort of have these people championing their work, like particular galleries that are really like, oh, I'm going to take charge of this, work with the estate and really promote it. Sometimes it's a really concerted effort for a great artist. In Abercrombie's case, again, I just see it as sort of like these different pockets of interest popping up in different areas. Like you have Chicago, you have New York, you have Karma Gallery, and the interest sort of bubbles up and then sort of comes together. One of the people that I spoke with, Kat Whiting from Christie's, she put it really well. She thinks of it as sort of like scaffolding as far as where an artist's market is concerned and what happens to like restore it or build it up, where you have both museum interest, collector interest, auction house interest. And she was saying with Abercrombie's work in particular, you have all those elements that are there really palpable and strong and working together in concert.
In terms of figures, I guess the interest around her seems most like the interest around someone like Hilma af Klint, who was a known artist, had a niche audience, was an early abstract painter of mystical themes, and then suddenly the switch flipped in the last few years and is suddenly just obviously a major character in art history.
Yeah.
And I guess that relates to what you were saying. I mean, some of the same elements are present. It's a woman artist who might have been overlooked because of that fact, and then also the mystical or cosmic themes that come into play. Those two things seem to be part of the story people are retelling in the art history right now.
Yeah. And I think you could also say that similar patterns have developed around Dorothea Tanning in terms of surrealism. Lynn Drexler, who was an overlooked abstract expressionist painter, has been getting a lot of attention in the last few years. And then also what a couple of the experts mentioned to me that I thought was interesting was when you look at the work of contemporary artists working today, like Christina Quarles or Loy Hollowell, you kind of see that influence of surrealism and telling a narrative with unusual imagery throughout their work. So it's sort of like looking forward and looking back.
Right. I love that. It's almost like the fourth part of that scaffolding you're talking about is the artists, contemporary artists working in a way, rediscovering a new part of our history as contemporary. And then that creates a new path into the present for an artist. Well, fantastic, Eileen. So before we end, I want to bring back Katie White to just ask about this contemporary resurgence. You've looked at her life. Why do you think that the life and art of Gertrude Abercrombie is resonating now?
I think that there are probably several reasons that are coming together. I think that her work has a graphic simplicity that translates really well to our time. I think that she's working in a language that actually a lot of figurative artists of today are interested in. Also, the language of the occult and magic and all of these things that are popular today, she kind of was talking about long before, just a renewed interest in female surrealist artists. And I think also that her life story is just really incredible. She's living this very unconventional lifestyle for a woman or for any person of her time, really immersed in like a wider community of thinkers and musicians and playwrights and all these types of unlikely characters. And it's over 80 years ago, which is pretty incredible to think about. And the last reason that I think that she's kind of so interesting to think about today is that she really like self-styled herself in a way that she kind of constructed perception of herself by the way she dressed in her kind of like a very elaborate dress, but then also in like who she chose to surround herself with, her home, the way she like brought people into her home and even like filled her home. I think it's all very prescient to the ways that artists try to present themselves now and something that she did way ahead of other people.
Fantastic. Yeah. It's the unconventional ones that come back, I guess. And Eileen, do you think there's any reason that this particular art resonates now?
Yeah, you know, what struck me when I first really started looking at the paintings was how modern and ahead of their time they are. Like a lot of them have these very sort of eerie images of women like suspended in these like odd landscapes. There seems to be this sort of like darker narrative going on that you kind of want to know more about. And one of the themes that comes up in discussions of her work, which I really kind of saw immediately, was these stories about isolation and the sense of isolation. And a couple of people I was having conversations with agreed that that's kind of strike a chord and is very resonant at a time like now when we're all supposedly connected 24 hours a day, right? On our phones and, you know, on Zoom meetings, on podcasts, whatever. But at the same time, there's this very eerie sense of isolation, everything from the pandemic to the aftermath. I think it's something that people still really feel and resonate with and can identify with these strange symbols in her paintings.
For sure. For sure. Well, Katie, thanks for coming on to give us a sense of the life of this very interesting artist.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Thanks for having me.
And Eileen, thanks for coming on to give us a sense of how this artist lives on.
Great to talk about it. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili, with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.